Alright everybody, welcome in. My name is Joe and let's talk some King's Indian defense. So we've talked about when you start playing chess, how to move beyond just pushing pieces around, and we started to develop some themes and some theories. We know what happens when we sit down and our opponent plays their king's pawn to e4. We're going to play our own king's pawn and we're going to end up in some kind of maybe an Italian or a Roy Lopez. And then we talked about what happens if your opponent plays something you're not familiar with. Is there a generic opening that we can get into? And the answer is yes. The King's Indian defense fits that for us for now. It's got lots of themes, and we've kind of talked about some of those themes. But this particular game I wanted to show kind of hits on a lot of those, and I was able to have a lot of fun with the King's Indian in a position that I wasn't familiar with. But just to remind you, the King's Indian is we're going to develop our knight, we're going to push the g-pawn, we're going to fianchetto our dark square bishop, and then we're going to castle. If at any point in time our opponent plays e4 or plays their king's pawn, we play d6, the king's pawn breaker. So the idea being here that if they push, we push, and we're stopping them from continuing that push. So that's our initial setup plan. And the King's Indian is kind of a setup opening. Doesn't really matter too much what the opponent's doing. We're probably going to put our pieces on the same squares. All right, we're just going to follow through with our plan. Now, we can't do that blindly, but as long as our opponent doesn't do anything to disrupt our plans, we go into the game with a plan in hand. We're going to stick to our themes. We're going to see where it takes us, and until our opponent says otherwise, we're just going to keep going with our plan. So let's take a look. Our opponent opens with something other than a king's pawn, so okay, what do? Well, we develop our knight. Then our opponent plays, we go to g6, our opponent does something. At no point have they played the king's pawn, so we don't need to do the king's pawn breaker, so we just continue with our development plan, and then our opponent plays something. He's not stopped us from castling. Okay, so we then castle ourselves. We're castled, our king side is all set up. Now we just need to develop our queen side. At some point in time, we're probably going to get ready for our d6. We're probably going to rotate this knight around to get it involved in the king side. If the center closes down, we can then shift to the queen side and we'll break open the center using our queen side pawns. If that happens, this knight is probably going to end up on c5. We see that as kind of a theme. But our main focus is going to be the king side attack, and we're just going to go from there. So my opponent plays castles. Haven't done anything to deviate from my plan, so I just go ahead and push the king's pawn breaker, get it out of the way, and it's ready to go. I can shift my knight around and start my development process. Now, at no point has anything changed from this plan, except I said, okay, my opponent is now coming in this way, but it doesn't look like the center is going to get closed down anytime soon. There's still too many kind of moves for that to happen, so I don't think we're going to be on the queen side of this game. It could happen, but realistically, it looks like the center is going to open up. And if the center opens up, I want this knight to be involved in the game on the king side as one of my themes that I've written down. And so I decided to develop it through c6, so that way it can come over here to e7, and then all the way over here to f5 eventually. So that's kind of my game plan. I have a game plan, and that's the difference between just pushing pieces around and doing just a basic study, right? So my opponent continues with their plan, and he's strengthening his center, and he's got it developed. So I can't capture, but I can continue. One of the themes, in fact, one of the main themes of the King's Indian defense is this e-pawn and f-pawn breaks. Those are the main central tenets to what we're doing. It's a little bit different than some of the other games, but that's okay. We know that this is a very strong theme in the King's Indian defense, and so nothing has stopped us from doing it, so now it's time to execute. And you notice, by developing our knight, we've already supported that pawn, and so we're in good shape. We have 1-2 defenders, our opponent has 1-2 attackers. We can happily park that guy there and see where it takes us. So my opponent continues with his plan. It looks like he's going to probably fianchetto. There is the possibility that he's going to bring that bishop out and attack down here. And one of the other themes we talk about with whenever we play a fianchetto structure, you want to look at clearing the space, right? Give your bishop a chance to fully power up, right? It's stuck in the corner, so give it a chance to fully power up, but also Should your opponent want to trade it away, and you decide you don't want to trade it away, you want to keep it, and you want to hide this bishop, you don't want your rook, in this case, to be a target. You don't want to leave it sitting there hanging. So one of the ideas behind a fianchetto is just to get it out of the way. Clear the space behind your fianchetto. We're adding these themes together, right? We're taking all these tiny little bite-sized pieces of information. We're just layering them on top of each other, and we're becoming better chess players. That's all we have to do, is take tiny little concepts and just kind of start stacking them on top of each other. And something like this, like fianchettoing and clearing the structure, right? Clearing the space behind a fianchetto. It's just one small piece of information that we now know. Now, at this point in time, I have a decision to make. Should I capture or should I not capture? Is it time to execute this break, or should I do other things first? And I decided at the time to go ahead and grab. Now, when I was analyzing this, in this particular game, it would actually be better for me to advance my central pawns. Now, hear me out. That's different than what a normal King's Indian was, but every game you want to be flexible and react to the position on the board. I'm sticking, and I played this by sticking with the themes, and we ended up in a great position anyway, but according to the engine, according to the supercomputers, the best move for black is to actually advance the central pawn. So you advance the e-pawn, it is defended, and now white needs to do something with their knight. Now, the knight has plenty of squares it can go to. It's not trapped. The engine says these are the best options. Notice that they immediately come with an attack on that. So there's two attackers, right? Two attackers and only one defender. So you advance your d-pawn and you defend. Now, this central structure shuts down the light square bishop. So this is a nice idea. Black has taken full control of the center, closed it down a little bit. We're forcing white then to have to disrupt their position to make some breaks. But this is a little bit outside of what I know at the time. I didn't realize this was a possibility. So I've talked about a grandmaster by the name of Daniel Naroditsky. Probably not pronouncing it correct. I believe he's an American from Russian heritage, I believe. He is a fantastic teacher, and one of the concepts he talks about is kinetic versus potential energy. The idea being in this particular position, this particular bishop, it's not doing anything. It's just kind of sitting there dead, right? It's not controlling any squares. It can't go anywhere. Its kinetic energy is very, very small. However, we've seen positions like this from our games we played where this bishop comes alive and becomes extremely powerful later on. It has the view that it could come alive and become very powerful later on. It has a lot of potential energy. So by setting our pawns in this particular position, excuse me, the engine is saying that we are blunting this piece significantly. And because our central pawns really can't go anywhere, our opponent has blocked in their c-pawn, so it's going to take them some time. The amount of time it's going to take them to disrupt our center, we have blunted this light square bishop for long enough that we basically removed it from the game while we continue on our plan. That's just one idea from this position. I didn't know that going into it, and that's okay. I didn't have to know that. I stuck with my theme. In the future, if I'm playing a game and I see this, maybe I'll try to remember that for the future. Maybe I'll keep an eye out, and I'll add that as a morsel into my tower of concepts. But either way, my opponent didn't do anything to kind of stop me from my plan, so I just broke open the center. I took the e-pawn. I took the d-pawn with my e-pawn. The opponent took back, and I started to bring my knight around. I probably should have at this point gone ahead and got my rook over and tried to control this open file. Even if I had done that, and even if my opponent had contested it, I'm not going to capture. I'm not going to take. That basically gives my opponent control of the open file. So I didn't really need to go ahead and justify sliding the rook over just yet. I do want this open file, right? That is an open file on the board, and we do want our rook involved. That's another nugget. We know that if there's an open file, our rook wants to control that. Well, in this case, I knew that my knight, one of the themes, sticking to those themes, man, bring our knight around. We know that it's probably going to end up over here somewhere. At this point in time, we see our opponent bring his long-range bishop into the attack. Perfect excuse for us to clear the space, right? Start getting control of the open file. My opponent does the same thing. So he's cleared the space. He's got control of the open file, or fighting for control. So at this point in time, I think to myself, you know what would be really nice? Start bringing these knights into the game. The F-pawn is another central theme of the King's Indian, and I would like to I need to move my knight out of the way so I can get my F-pawn ready to go. Now, in this particular position, I don't need to do that. We've already busted open the center. But I could stick a knight here to help fight for control of the center and bring threats to my opponent's king side. I could stick my knight here. So if I had a knight here and a knight here, that'd be kind of cool to have a lot of control over what's going on right in front of my opponent's king. To do that, I do need a little bit of space here. I mean, I need a pawn here, right? I need this thing to be defended. And at the same time, one of the themes of the King's Indian defense is our dark square bishop is going to be very strong. If we can remove their dark square bishop, then our dark square bishop has no competitor. There's no competition, has full control of all the dark squares by himself. So I would like to push this pawn for a couple of reasons, including giving my opponent a chance to trade off his dark square bishop for my knight. I would be fine with that trade because that helps accomplish one of my goals of the King's Indian. I start by supporting this pawn push. It's the C pawn push. That's okay. We've seen it before. It's fine. It's not a great move, but it gets the job done. So my opponent decides to go ahead and try to fight for the center with his knight. This gives me an excuse to trade off knights. And one of the things that I see is if I trade here, the only thing my opponent has to take back is the rook. I was going to park my pawn here anyway, so that comes with an attack directly on the rook. Tempo. So I decide, you know what, let's go ahead and trade, push my pawn, and now my opponent, this is probably the first major mistake. At no point in time do either of us make really major mistakes until the end of the game. This move here is probably the only mistake, and even then it's not really a mistake, it's just a positional mistake. By this rook sliding over, yes, we see the plan. We know exactly what the plan is. My opponent wants to get this knight into the game. My opponent wants to put pressure. I mean, my opponent is going to bring in the attack big time to the king side. That's pretty obvious. But we know that we're going to bring this knight around anyway, and shoot, that happens to come with an attack directly on that rook. Well, the rook can't come down here. The rook either has to go back, or the rook is going to end up directly in line with our light square bishop. The light square bishop, we know, has very, very low potential energy in these positions. It's just a theme of the King's Indian defense. The light square bishop doesn't really get involved in the game and doesn't really do a whole lot. So my opponent, putting his rook here, ends up playing into my favor because he moves it out of the way. If I move this knight, now my bishop can actually do something worthwhile in the game. At some point in time, I was planning on just taking this light square bishop and just trading it away for this middling knight. But now I could trade it away for a whole rook. So I start looking at ways to maybe move my knight out of the way to open up this attack and try to find opportunities, right, to get a 2-for-1. This is a discovered attack. I looked at this attack here. So the knight grabbing on d4. My opponent has that sufficiently defended, though, so I grab, he grabs, I grab the rook, he grabs my bishop. I've traded away 2 pieces for a rook. That's not always a great thing. Now, when I calculated this with the engine said I still had enough of an advantage that it was worthwhile to do it. But over the board at the time, I just didn't like the idea. I didn't like trading away 2 valuable pieces, 2 pieces, even if they aren't extremely valuable, 2 pieces for a rook. So I just decided to take the easy way around. Excuse me. If my opponent wants the trade-off, I'm happy with that. But I am threatening here. Now my opponent repeated. I could have just repeated a move to see where my opponent puts that rook, but I decided at this point in time, now's a good chance to take advantage of the fact that I've got a central pawn and I can stick my knight there. This knight has to move in order for my opponent to dislodge it. And at some point in the game, in the future, he does do that specifically to dislodge. But for now, I have definitely increased this knight's both potential and kinetic energy. We now have a knight near our opponent's king, and there are some valuable pieces sticking around. All right, so from here, my opponent redirects his knight, or his bishop, excuse me, wants to bring it into the game, trade off for my extremely good dark square bishop. That's one of the themes. I do not want him to do that. I want to make sure that he is unable to do this. And so I spot a quick tactic. Doesn't win me any material, but it does put things in my favor. So how do I remove this bishop? I could happily trade it away for this knight if I could find a way to get my knight there. There's a fork here, and I could get there by way of attacking the queen. So that's what I do. I rotate my knight, attack the queen. My opponent simply moves the queen out of the way, sets up a battery, but I come in with check. My opponent can't capture because we've opened up the center, right? We've powered up our pieces. We've opened up the center, so my opponent can't capture. But he simply moves the king. I grab the bishop. He recaptures back. Again, we are perfectly even in material. The only difference here is he has a knight, I have a bishop. Everything else is identical, equal material on the board. But we have now accomplished so many of our goals in the King's Indian that when we look at the engine evaluation, which the engine doesn't care what opening you're playing, the engine just looks at the state of the board as is, from here calculates out who has a better chance of winning the game. And because we have powered up all of our pieces, the engine gives us -3. We're black pieces, so we're up 3.5 points. That's a really good position to be in as we shift from the mid game, getting ready to move towards an end game almost. All right, so next up on the board, my light square bishop wasn't doing anything. I just use this as an excuse to get it out. It still doesn't do a whole lot, but now at least it's involved in the game. Here goes my opponent to try to reroute his knight. I take this as an opportunity to trade off our light square bishops. If I can get rid of his other bishop, then I'm content. My light square bishop wasn't really doing anything anyway. Case in point, though, his light square bishop's not really doing anything either. We ended up in a position where I was able to create some kind of barrier against this bishop. The bishop can get out, though, now that the position is opening up. So the potential energy we're starting to see convert to kinetic energy. We're starting to see that bishop come alive. So I took it as an opportunity to try to trade. My opponent passed, blocked off his own bishop, which is a good thing for me, but at the same time forces my bishop. So basically killing the momentum of my light square bishop. So both of our light square bishops are kind of useless at this point in time. It's at this point in time that we notice, right? I noticed this alignment issue. And I was like, I wonder if I can take advantage of that alignment issue. Well, before I do that, I do want to connect my rooks, and I do want to get my queen into the game. So I tried to be a little sneaky, and I routed my queen out this way to put pressure along this long diagonal, right through the center pawn, maybe pick that up in the process. That's the idea. So my opponent chases my light square bishop. I just have to retreat it. Now my bishop is completely dead. It doesn't do anything. Kinetic and potential energy reduced to 0. Notice that this light square bishop is doing nothing. It has done nothing really all game. If my opponent can simply activate his light square bishop, then we could see that become a threat later on. It was at this point in time I decided now's the time to go for this attack. And this is probably my biggest mistake in this entire game. What have we been talking about this whole time? Thematically, I'm not losing material. In fact, I go up material. But thematically, what have we been talking about? How strong this piece is, right? We've gone out of our way to eliminate the opponent's dark square bishop so that this can be powered up to the extreme. This rook has been kind of out of the game for a while, and it's not really doing anything. Okay, yeah, it has a lot of potential energy, right? Sitting right here above our king, but everything's defended, right? We can even stick that bishop there if we wanted to at some point in time. Yeah, it's acting just like a pawn, but it strengthens the defensive structure. So this rook has a lot of potential energy, but not really doing a whole lot, right? My opponent, this knight, if you look at this knight now, if we go all the way back, this knight, he needed to get it out of the way in order to open up his bishop, and it really hasn't done a whole lot. He had to rotate it back, you know, holding it back for a later time. You know, it's got potential energy, but not a lot of kinetic. And by this maneuver, my opponent was able to bring his knight back into the game, and I trade away my super strong bishop, one of the main central themes of the King's Indian defense. I traded away for a bad rook and give him a good knight. So this is probably my biggest mistake of the game. And if we look at the engine, the engine says that I am at 6.5 points in favor, 6.5 to 7. Black is obviously doing very good here. And as we shift things around, look at this. We're moving up to 7.5, almost 8 points of advantage in Black's favor, right up until I move my dark square bishop. So yes, I'm still ahead. Yes, I'm still ahead by a significant amount, but this is a 2 to 3 point swing. If everything else on this board was equal, this could be a losing move, because this piece is so strong, this piece not so strong, and trading it away does more harm than good. So positionally, thematically, yeah, in fact, leaving the pin here is stronger than actually capturing. Once I make that trade, it's even worse for me. I mean, granted, again, I'm still winning, but going from an 8-point win to a 5-point win, I've given back 3 points of advantage for no reason. So thematically, I've worked all game to power up this bishop. It's pointless for me to throw it away at this point in time. I should have held on to it, and I didn't. So now I'm just going to go ahead and double up my rooks. I have sole control of the open file, but now we are shifting to an end game, and I'm going to kind of breeze through this end game pretty quickly. My opponent makes a huge mistake right here, and I'm able to take advantage of it. I wouldn't call it a mistake. My opponent goes for a tactic that, well, let's just go into it. My opponent takes this knight and sacrifices it. He wants to get his queen into the game. That's obvious. He wants to get his bishop into the game and his rook into the game. He wants to bring the fight to me. He's got 3 pawns over here ready to storm. My opponent wants to bring the fight. I think he's about 1 to 2 moves premature on this sacrifice. I think my opponent probably would want to get this bishop into the game first before this sacrifice. I think that's really the only mistake here. But my opponent sacrifices a full piece in order to start the attack. My rook was undefended, but the whole plan was to get the other rook involved anyway, so now I have complete control over the only open file. And here comes the pawn storm. It's at this moment in time that I want to simplify things a little bit. We are in an obvious winning endgame. I traded away my bishop for a rook, and then my opponent gave me back a knight. So I'm up a full rook. So this is obviously winning for me if I can stop my opponent's attack. And one of the best ways to do that is to basically remove his other pieces from the game. Notice this bishop is still not doing anything, and this rook has been out of the game. I throw in a check. My opponent can't come this way, either has to come up the board, giving me another free check, or has to step away. He steps away, so that gives me basically free reign to trade off a pair of rooks. And this is my second real mistake in this game. And even then, it's not a mistake, it's a lesson that I can learn. So my opponent then makes a great move, brings his king back to the game, immediately attacking my rook. Now I have that square covered, so I can simply, in my mind, what I said was I'll bring my rook to the 7th row, or the 2nd row in this case, have pressure on that bishop, have a free pawn sitting there for me, and I'm in a winning position. But when we look at this particular position, my light square bishop is not doing anything. His light square bishop, not doing anything. His queen definitely doing something. My queen, actually not really doing so much. I can't get in for defense because I'm blocked in by my own pieces. I can't really get into the attack. Well, okay, I could get into the attack this way. But once I move my rook here, I no longer can get into the attack this way. I can't get into the attack this way. I'm trapped. I have trapped my own queen accidentally. So there's this cage, and my queen is inside the cage. And here is a great opportunity. I could have brought my queen out. Once the king moves, then I can bring the queen wherever, right? Bring it in as part of the defensive structure. Maybe look at trading off the queens, take my overwhelming advantage, win the game. So I have this on the board, and I could have done it. I didn't think about it at the time. I figured, you know what? Let me just bring the rook in, save my queen to do something else later. But I should have taken it one step further and realized my queen's outside of the game. This entire game, we've seen that everything's been focused on the king side, and now that my queen is over here on the queen side, I'm not really doing anything. So my opponent moves, and that's when I kind of realize, oh, yeah, I can't do anything. So I just reposition my king to help better defend this structure. My opponent continues the attack, and so I decide, you know what, I'm up a full rook, I'm up so much material, I sacrifice in exchange in order to bring my queen into the game, throw a couple checks in just to see where my opponent's king's going. There's really nothing here, so I just bring my queen back exactly like I wanted to. My opponent trades off a pair of pawns, I force a queen trade, and now we're into an end game with kings versus pawns. I do have an extra bishop at the end of the day. It's that semi-useless light square bishop, but I can finally get it involved in the game. But here we are on move 40, and this bishop is finally doing something. Oh well. So at this point in time, my opponent makes his last major mistake. And this is just an endgame training thing that we're all trying to learn, but this particular move here. If we notice that, yes, it comes with check, and I do have to move my king, but my king has several places he can go. His king, though, does not. You notice this king cannot come down here. It's blocked by his pawn now, and once I step up, keeping contact with both of the pawns, my king creates a barrier. This king can no longer get involved, and the king can only now go away from these two pawns. At this point in time, if my opponent were to try to defend, I could grab, but notice I still control all of these squares. My pawn controls that square. My opponent's king now has to go the other way, all the way around. If we change the move order, this is just an end game lesson. If we change the move order, my opponent brings their f pawn. I'm going to make a nothing move, and then brings the g pawn. Notice now, yes, I can get up into this key square to attack both the pawns, but then my opponent can get there in time to defend. The king defends the back of the pawn chain, the back of the pawn chain defends the head. This structure is not going anywhere. Now we have to shift everything to the queen side, and a fight would happen, but this pawn is not going anywhere. These pawns could create a passed pawn on this side, and so I would have to focus on making sure my opponent, you know, let's say this, and then this, and then this, and now my opponent has a passed pawn, right? So this is an endgame that could happen. Now, I would have to use my bishop and probably just sacrifice my bishop for that pawn, and then now that my king is in better position, I could start gobbling up on this side. But we basically have lost our entire advantage for something like that. But that's not how it happened. My opponent made a mistake here, allowed my king to maintain contact, block out his king, and so he had to go around. I picked up the pawn, and now we're just in an end game. I got my bishop into the game, defended by a pawn and defending the pawn. We know that this structure is extremely strong in an end game and is not going anywhere. So my opponent now can't do anything about this, has to leave control of his f pawn to go play on the queen side. And you can see now, I mean, with this bishop, the opponent can't even get in to the board, right? Can't even move in without having to go all the way around and in. So my opponent starts pushing the pawns. One of the things that we know is we want to isolate, and we want to make sure our opponent doesn't get connected passed pawns. Isolated pawns we can deal with, connected passed pawns we can't. So we just allow our opponent to make some trades. We make sure that we don't allow our opponent to have both of these connected passed pawns. If our opponent pushes past, that's fine. He would have to push past, and then we can capture, and then we have an isolated pawn. In this case, my opponent captures, and I'm okay with capturing back. This is a passed pawn, a central passed pawn that my opponent has defended with his king. But in this case, I have one of the squares covered, so I could happily sacrifice this bishop. I have a 2 versus 1 on the far side, and my opponent's king is going to have to leave control of the f-pawn in order to carry his passed pawn to victory. And at that point in time, I grab and then push my outside passed pawn. So this is definitely in a winning position now. I'm very comfortable, and we're just going to run through the end. Trade. I now have 2 passed pawns. My opponent, notice, right, we got this covered. Now that this pawn is so far advanced, my opponent has to go after it. There is nothing he can do but go after it. Technically, I could grab a queen, let him grab a queen, and then I come in with check first. But that adds a ton of confusion that I don't want to deal with. But if my bishop leaves, that means my opponent's king is going to grab that pawn. That's okay. Watch. I grab the bishop. He moves over. I can't stop him from taking that pawn. Even if I promote it, he just grabs. Not even going to bother. Because if I grab here, he grabs here. Even if this bishop is gone, even if this bishop has nothing to do with anything, my king is in between his and the pawn. My king is going to create a wall that his king can never pass through, and my pawn will promote. And when we look at that, we look at the key square. This pawn is going to promote here. The key square, if I can get my king here, my king is defending all 3 of the red carpet squares and creating a wall that the opponent's king can never get through. So as long as my king gets to that square before my opponent does, I win the game. Easy. And that's exactly what happens. My opponent's too far away, so I grab pawn, he grabs pawn. I'm just going to head for this square. I'm going to leave my pawn alone. If the king tries to make it all the way back here, before the king gets there, I'll start moving the pawn up. But all I want to do is get my king to basically the golden square. In this case, it's f2, so that my g-pawn can promote. My opponent tries to sneak in, but he's too little too late. I now have the key square. There is nothing my opponent can do. I just walk a pawn to victory. I still have a bishop. I could let him have it for free. We know how to checkmate with a king versus with a king and queen versus a king. We know how to checkmate if this was a rook and a king versus a king. We know how to do that. I could have let him have it for free, but I decided to keep it on the board. I didn't even use it though. I ended up just doing the standard king and queen checkmate pattern. I even moved the bishop out of the way, so it wasn't part of the problem. At this point in time, my queen wants to come here or here for a checkmate. Notice these 3 are covered. So I waste a move. This king has no place to go, can't go here, can't go up there, can only go here, and then we slam the door, checkmate. So we win the game. But the whole concept, all of that comes back to the very beginning, that we don't know what our opponent's playing, and that's okay. We're going to follow along with this King's Indian defense. We're going to follow along with the basic themes. If we see the king's pawn, we play king's pawn breaker. We're going to bring this knight all the way around to the king side. We're going to look for a king side attack at some point in time. Maybe eliminate the dark square bishop in the process. The main features being an E pawn break or an F pawn break. Those are our main features. And you saw we were able to accomplish all those things. Even though we don't know exactly what our opponent's doing, we just follow along with those basic themes, and we were able to play a really great game of chess. So this was a lot of fun. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll catch some more games. We'll try to get some more King's Indian. We'll keep adding little morsels of information on top of it, and see if we can come up with some more fun games. I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Bye.